Okay, another live with Think Dyslexia. Right. Let's get my guest on. Hi there. How are you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hi.
All right, there we go. Perfect. All right.
Awesome.
So I would love to get started with this amazing conversation that I know we've been advertising for, I don't know, a few days now.
Yes.
So I see some people are joining. Let's get started. So everyone, welcome to this live. I am Dr. Lauren and I am the owner of Think Dyslexia. I always like to start off my lives by sharing that I am a special educator. I am not an adult with dyslexia. This is just something I'm really passionate about and something that has evolved in the 10 years that I've been a special educator. So this week, I am super excited to talk with another special educator. So Rebekah Poe is a K through 6 resource special educator and has been in the special education field for about a decade, and she's based out of Alabama. So we've connected on Instagram, and I'm really curious to hear all about what's going on in your school district, what you know about literacy and dyslexia, and really just kind of get that conversation started as another educator. So before we start this conversation, I do want to share with the audience, we have 4 questions that we're going to kind of delve into. So the first one is really, what is your experience as a special educator with dyslexia and language-based disabilities in the classrooms, and how do you accommodate students? What does dyslexia look like in Alabama? And this one I'm really curious about, like historically, what does your caseload look like demographically?
Right.
And then also, what tips can you offer to kind of close that literacy gap?
Gotcha.
So let's start off with the first question. So as a special educator, what is your experience with dyslexia and language-based disabilities look like, and how have you accommodated students with these learning differences?
All right. So as a resource teacher, the majority of my students do have specific learning disability. I'm not in the self-contained classroom. Sorry, I apologize.
No problem.
I'm not in a self-contained classroom, so most of my students do have a learning disability, and a lot of times that is in language or reading comprehension. So for me, with my students, we have really tried to get into a multisensory pathway for learning. Right. Because when you're working with different senses, when you've got the visual, the auditory, kinesthetic, you're lighting up different parts of the brain all at the same time. And it's kind of able to bring all of those parts together so that the student is able to not only learn but retain the information, rather than just relying on one method of instruction. When you have all of those different things firing at the same time, it works a lot better for all students, but especially students with learning disabilities.
Right. No, and I 100% agree with that. I think I used to be a public school teacher. I think it was a little bit challenging to kind of get teachers to understand that multisensory is not just for one specific learner. Obviously, it benefits a specific learner, but it's great for the greater good of all learners. And
absolutely.
So why not get all those neurons firing so you can really have a greater impact?
Definitely.
That's good. That's really good to hear. So what does dyslexia look like in Alabama? Are teachers well versed in knowing what this disability looks like and how to detect it? I'm sure it varies at the elementary level versus the secondary level, but I'm based out of Maryland, so I'm curious to know what's going on in Alabama.
Okay, well, speaking from my district, I'm not sure how it is throughout the state, but my district specifically, we do dyslexia screeners for students when they're very young in elementary school, so we can go ahead and start noticing whether or not they're going to need more intensive interventions than a typical student. And we're not diagnosing with dyslexia, we are screening for it. So do you have dyslexic tendencies?
Right.
Yeah, because we're not medical professionals, we cannot diagnose, but if we see, hey, we're seeing something that looks similar to dyslexia, let's go ahead and start some of those interventions now while they're so young, rather than waiting and saying, hey, something's really not right here. This student is not progressing the way that we think they should. What's going on? Oh, they're showing tendencies similar to dyslexia. So what we've done is, everyone does the screeners, but my district has in the last couple of years really switched their mindset from, drilling sight words, drilling letters, names. Now we're focusing more on what it takes to read rather than just reading itself, if that makes sense. I know it kind of sounds strange, but we've really focused on the Orton-Gillingham methods where that multisensory learning comes in. So the student is writing the letter, making the sound of the letter, seeing the letter, and we also get them to write it in a sand tray. So it's tactile. Yeah.
Yes,
so they have all of those pathways firing at the same time, and it really helps keep it in their brains, keep it in their minds, and helps them retain it for longer. And like I said earlier, some students don't need all of that going on at one time, but it's not going to hurt them. Like they are still going to succeed with one method as they would with another method. But for the students who need that multisensory learning, it's so much easier for the teacher to just make that the baseline, make that the tier 1 intervention that everyone is receiving, and then go up from there.
Right. No, that sounds great. So what's the earliest in your school district that they do screening? Is it kindergarten?
I'm not 100% sure now. I've switched to middle school, so I'm really just with the 6th graders, but I want to say that we started looking at it in maybe 1st grade, 2nd grade, so still young, but perhaps not kindergarten level. Kindergarten, it can be kind of tricky because you don't know what kind of pre-knowledge they have, if somewhere in a pre-K program, somewhere in a Head Start program, and then somewhere at home. So it's hard to get a baseline for kindergartners because we see 5-year-olds coming to us that know how to read, and we see 5-year-olds who have never seen a letter before in their lives.
That's true. That's very true. But I mean, I 100% agree. Like the younger you can identify, the better. And I also think it's good that you talked about the differences between identifying and not diagnosing, because I think sometimes parents get confused about that. They're like, oh, you said this, but it's like, I'm a special educator. I'm not a school psychologist or a psychologist to actually give you that diagnosis. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yes.
I'm really curious about the demographics on your caseload. So I know for me personally, I've seen students of color that are identified with, SLD or LD and, or even emotional disabilities, which I know that can be a whole different other live, but
it'll be a whole other day.
I know, exactly. But I'm curious to know, like, how many students that have reading comprehension issues have been on your caseload, and what do the students look like? Are they white? Are they Black? Are they Hispanic? I don't know the demographics in your school district, but I'm just curious, and also wondering if you feel as a special educator that literacy is a social justice issue in your school district.
Well, when I was earning my master's degree, we were looking at several different cases, and we looked at, case studies, sample students, different studies that had been done. And something that continuously stuck out to me was the number of African Americans, particularly African American males, who are identified in special education. And that's something that I've talked about, last summer, was, you have a teacher who has maybe a white student, and that student is just, they're a handful, they're energetic. Then you have a student of color exhibiting the same behaviors. Oh, I don't know what to do with them. It's a mindset, it's an attitude. And sometimes it is learned, and people might not realize that they're doing it, but they're still doing it, and it is still harmful. We need to level the playing field and take the race issue out of special education. If it's special education for one child, it should be special education for another child, and vice versa. If it's not for one, then it's not for the other.
Right.
For my school, Alabama is a very diverse state depending on your area. So I live in the central part of Alabama, and my school is predominantly African American. We're about 50% African American, 30% Caucasian, 20% Hispanic.
Okay, so it's pretty diverse.
It's very diverse. Then you have other schools where everyone is African American. You have other schools where everyone is Caucasian.
Right.
It really just depends on the area. Because we're not a huge state, but we're fairly large, and it's very diverse depending on the area that you're in. Right. So for my caseload, I worked I've worked for a couple of years at a school that was, 95% African American. I think we had 2 white kids in the entire school, and they were in the same family.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah. So for that school, my caseload was African American because that was the type of school that I was in. So now working at the middle school where I am, it's pretty well balanced.
Okay.
It's always a little heavier on the male gender than it is on female.
Right.
And there is, I think, a disproportionality that comes up from, gender identity. You expect something from a male that you don't expect from a female, or vice versa. But there is definitely, I think, nationwide, an overrepresentation of African American males in special education. And at the same time, on the other hand, there's an underrepresentation of some other ethnicities. Asian, for one, is typically underidentified.
Yes,
and
I would agree with that for sure.
So it's interesting to me how, even special education, even education at all, can be a social justice issue, and it shouldn't be. We should be providing the same educational opportunities to everyone, but we have some students who come from a family where they've been very transient in their early school years, so they didn't get that strong foundation in reading the way they would if they had perhaps stuck to one school for year after year. And we see that a lot with the Hispanic community. They come in to an area, and they work for a little while, and they move somewhere else. They follow the job, and the students are the ones who are suffering, not because their parents aren't wanting what's best for them, and they're not doing their best for them, but because the system is designed for a certain demographic.
Yes. No, and I think everything you said, I completely agree with. And I think this is really weird to say. It's comforting but discomforting to know it's the same thing happening here as it's happening there. And I guess, and I know this is kind of an add-on question, because I know we have a little bit more time before we get to our last one. Do you feel the teachers, well, first of all, what are the demographics of the staff in your school? Are they mostly white women? Are there male teachers of color? Because I'm curious as to what that looks like when you have the population that you described.
So my school, I'll tell you the demographics of my hallway. We have, I share a classroom with the other 6th grade resource teacher. She is African American.
Okay.
3 more teachers on that hallway are Caucasian, 1 male, 2 female, and then an African American woman teaches English. Then the other side of the hallway, we have African American female science, African American female math, Caucasian English, Caucasian social studies.
Okay.
But then you get into the upper grades, and it's the same. We're a good mix. There are African American male teachers who teach something other than PE.
That's good to know too. or that they're not just the custodians, because I know that's something that is a big issue too.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
So our students can look at our staff, and they can see themselves, regardless of their race, ethnicity, culture. Our school is very diverse, and I love that about my school very much.
That's awesome. No, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's good for other educators who are listening to this, or parents, to hear that too.
So our administrator is African American woman. One of our assistant principals is an African American male who was actually in the military. So he's got a very strong presence, and the boys everybody loves him. Yeah,
that's like a great role model right there.
Definitely.
Yes. I love that. Well, this brings me to my last question.
Okay.
To kind of come back to literacy, because I know this is an underlying issue, and it's a problem in our country and globally. But what tips can you offer as a special educator to kind of close that literacy gap in general, in your school district, worldwide, whatever you can offer? I'd love to hear.
Absolutely. So I kind of mentioned with you earlier that I have a philosophy about that bridging the gap phrase, but I want to reiterate it here. When I think of a bridge, that's something that gets you from point A to point B. That kind of goes over the emptiness, the space that is there, and sometimes it has to be torn down and rebuilt. Sometimes it has to be changed. So in my mind, the bridge, to bridge the gap, that's the accommodations that are provided in, RTI, in special education. Those are the It's the read aloud services. It's the
Mm-hmm.
assistive technology. It's something that gets the information to them.
Right.
What we need to be focusing on is not having that gap in the first place.
Right.
So
Right.
there's not a need for a bridge. And honestly, the best way I think to do that is to start as early as possible.
Yes.
Parents can do this with their children. When you're driving around town, you see a billboard. Oh, I see an S. S says different ways to get media to them. And there's never going to be anything that replaces a book with pages
Right.
and pictures and sitting with a grown-up, looking at the letters, making the sounds, putting them all together. And starting young like that with the exposure
Mm-hmm.
helps out. And then, moving on to rhyming words, moving on to word families, things like that. But
Right.
the interventions that we have to have in place, we need to get them started as quickly as possible. And I really feel like multisensory learning, getting hands-on, getting the information to the children, that's how we're going to be able to fill that gap, so that by the time they get into 6th grade, hopefully it's, for a special education student, getting to grade level is the goal. Right. But if they were at grade level, they wouldn't be in special education. So I'm not saying, oh, we're going to be able to do this and it's going to get them to a level playing field and everybody's, not going to be a need for special education anymore. But if we can fill that gap up just a little bit at a time, year after year, continue pouring into that child, we're going to see more of a difference than, oh, we need to make a bridge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think sometimes the issue with that, because I 100% agree, I started when my youngest daughter came home from the hospital, like I read to her like the first day. Like, I could sit up and feel like, oh,
exactly.
And so,
yeah.
But not all families know that, and not all families like know the importance of that. And so I know that that's another discussion too, to like, how can we educate communities to know that language is so important, even if, you're reading something that you're like, they're not going to comprehend this at 2. It's not about that. It's about the language, hearing sound.
It's about exposure. Yes.
Exactly. But I think if we can get all states and districts to really get these early screeners in,
Absolutely.
and then to educate, because I really want to get to the root of the issue where these pre-service teachers at universities aren't being taught, really like, what is dyslexia? What does this look like? How can I identify? And I think if we can kind of, I know I hate to say bridge the gap, but if we can get to that root of the teachers in the universities and then the school districts, then hopefully this won't be an issue. But I know that this continues to be an issue.
I think, for special education teachers, we went to school for it. So we had a lot of exposure to, learning disabilities and things like that. General education teachers, I think, in their programs, depending on the program, you might take like 1 class on special education.
Yes.
And since we are seeing such an increase in numbers of learners with learning disabilities, that needs to be addressed more in that pre-service stage, rather than throwing these new teachers into a classroom without them being prepared.
Yes. And I feel like we as teachers go into this field with good intentions and a good heart. I don't think there's ever been not one teacher that's like, I'm going into this profession to ruin a kid. Now, I know over time, some teachers need to retire. But I think in general, we want to be that support. But I think sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And we feel like we're doing what's best. And
sometimes we feel like if we ask for help, then it makes us look like we don't know what we're doing.
Exactly. There's a lot of pressure on us.
There is.
Especially elementary school teachers. I mean, I taught elementary school for 4 years. It's a lot. It is. And so, I think there are so many different things. And I really, truly feel people appreciate teachers more during this pandemic. Because parents are seeing like, I can't help my kid, like I need my teacher. So it's just, there's a lot to be discussed about that. And I know, again, that could be another live, and I know we're coming.
I'll come back anytime. We can talk about everything.
I love it. Well, Rebekah, this has been such an awesome conversation, and I hope that our audience really got some good information that they could benefit from, and just to kind of hear 2 special educators kind of sharing their thoughts and feelings about literacy and what that looks like. So this will be posted on my account.
Okay.
And I will tag you in it, and this will also be on YouTube for anyone to share. So
Awesome.
I hope this message just continues to get out to everyone, and hopefully we can see a change.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks, Rebekah, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.